Hello and welcome back to World War II TV and what is going to be the last show of 2021. But don't worry, we've got lots more shows coming up next year, working on schedules today, in fact. But today, the last of the trio of shows this week about the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, and we're continuing our look at armour. For those who've been with us the last week or so, we had that wonderful show with Bill Nance about the cavalry groups. We talked yesterday about the 4th Armoured Division's medical battalions. Various other units have come up in discussions. Don Fox, of course, talked about 4th Arm, but today we are talking about a particularly important engagement and one where our author kind of puts it as the place the Germans lost the battle. So I've had some really prolific authors on World War II TV over the last 12 months, 18 months. Dilip Sarkar is particularly prolific, James Holland, of course, but Steven Zaloga has written an incredible amount of books. I mean, all sorts of subjects, modern warfare, artillery, tanks. But the book I'm holding in my hand is what we're talking about today, Smashing Hitler's Panzers, about the Battle of the Bulge. So without further ado, I'll introduce Steven Zaloga. So good afternoon, sir. How are you today?
Doing quite well, thank you.
So, you know, as you said, you've written an extraordinary amount of books, and some of them are kind of very technical about artillery pieces or self-propelled guns. What is it about this campaign that drew you, and why did you feel the need to write what is one of your kind of more in-depth books?
Well, I have two different professional backgrounds. My day-to-day work is for an aerospace consulting company, so I'm dealing mostly with military technology. In my professional work, I deal with missile systems and drones. And I've traditionally been interested in the history of military technology, especially tanks, tank warfare, anti-tank technology. But on the other hand, my academic background is in history in general, and military history in particular. So I do enjoy taking a break from the technical history stuff and doing the occasional campaign books or battle books, that sort of thing. I started becoming interested in the Ardennes campaign really more on the tank side. I did some early books on tank warfare in the Ardennes. But back about a decade ago, I have been writing titles for the Osprey campaign series, and they wanted a couple of books dealing with the Ardennes campaign. So I did two for them, one on the northern shoulder, the Battle of Saint-Vith and Krinkau-Rocheroth, and another one on Bastogne and the southern side of the battle. And of the two, I found the one on the northern shoulder to be more interesting because it's not dealt with as often as Bastogne, especially from a U.S. perspective. Whenever you hear about the Battle of the Bulge, it tends to focus on Bastogne. And that's fine. I mean, there's lots of reasons for it. It's very dramatic. You know, Pan's Third Army goes charging up there, and there's the drama of the Battle of Bastogne. So I can understand why it is so popular. But as I was looking at the battles for the northern shoulder, it occurred to me that not only are they overlooked, but they're especially important if you back off and look at it from the German perspective and not the American perspective. Why did the German offensive in the Ardennes fail? And I don't really think that the Bastogne sector gives you the answer to that. I think that you do have to look at the campaign in the first few opening days, because as I'll talk about in a moment, you have to see where the German main emphasis was. And I'll argue here that it was up in the northern sector. And so the fate of the battle depends on that sector. So when I did the earlier book, the Little Osprey campaign book, I said, this is a good subject. It needs more attention. And I decided to focus in on a narrow part of the story. There's actually a broader story that can be done about the northern shoulder. But aspects of the northern shoulder have been dealt with, especially, for example, Kampfgruppe Piper. There's lots of books on Kampfgruppe Piper. I didn't want to get involved in that mess. There's more than enough coverage of that. The Battle of Saint-Vith hadn't been covered very well, but in the past year or so, a number of books have come out. So that aspect of the northern shoulder has been covered. But what I wanted to cover is the issue of 12th.SS-Pz.Panzer Division. Very important unit, very well known for its fighting in Normandy. But it disappears from the history when it comes to the Ardennes. And one of the reasons it disappears from the history is they're defeated within the first few days of the campaign. And so what my book deals with is 12th.SS-Panzer Division, what role did they have in the German plans, and what's the bigger consequence of their failure in the first few days of the campaign. So maybe we can jump to the next slide, and I'll sort of outline what I want to do here. To begin with, I want to sort of define what what were the Germans trying to accomplish? What was their operational objective? What was the Schwerpunkt of the German plan? That is the focal point. To examine when the Germans realized that these objectives could not be achieved, meaning when they realized that the offensive had failed. And then, of course, why did the plan fail? If we know when it failed, we also have to know why it failed. So let's jump over to the next one.
And if I just jump in for a second here, Stephen, I think you're correct there. What you were talking about, that the intro there, but about needing to examine the Battle of the Bulge from the German point of view, because we've kind of got used post D-Day to talking about everything from the Allied point of view. The earlier part of the war, Blitzkrieg, we talk about from the German point of view, but there's sort of that change mid-war where historians try to start to write about events from our point of view, the Allied point of view, and the Germans are reacting. But of course, to understand the Ardennes, it is for the first time in several months, the Allies reacting to the Germans. So I think it's logical to me that we focus on it from the German side to understand it.
Exactly, because this is one campaign where the Germans have the initiative. They're not responding to the Allies. And so, to a large extent, if you don't understand what they were trying to accomplish in the Ardennes, you can't really judge how the battle went. And the problem has been is that much of the writing about the Ardennes is focused more on the Allied intentions. The Allies think this about the German plans. The Allies react in this fashion. So what I try to do in the book, I have quite a bit of coverage of how the Allies react, especially the U.S. Army. But I started out as a core of saying, what were the Germans trying to do and how did they accomplish it? And I'm not going to go into detail on this chronology that's up here. This is a lot of detail about how the plan evolved, how it started in the middle of September, and how it evolved, how the OKW, the Armed Forces High Command viewed the task, some of the options. I'm not going to go into all of the options because basically the bottom line was OKW, as Hitler had originally proposed, felt that the only objective that was worthwhile, or the only sector where there was any chance of success, was the Ardennes. And there's a number of reasons for this. Hitler's idea is basically that he's losing the war. He needs a last desperate gamble in order to change the fortunes of the war, to shift the initiative to Germany's side. And in many sectors, he feels he can't accomplish that. For example, on the Eastern Front, the Red Army is simply too big, too powerful. Any attempt to wrest strategic control from the Red Army at this stage is unlikely to succeed. But he looks to the West and he thinks about his greatest victory, the battle against France in May, June 1940. He remembers the success of the German Panzer Force in the Ardennes, and he also remembers the evacuation of the British Army at Dunkirk. And so his September plan is something of a revision of 1940 and what he calls the new Dunkirk. So the strategic objective is to push between the U.S. Army and the British Army, race up to Antwerp, up to the big port, and therefore divide the two allies. And he's hoping against hope that that an Allied failure will lead to a strategic breakup between Britain and the United States. In reality, we look back at that, and that seems really kind of goofy. But at the time, in Hitler's fevered mind, that seemed like one of his only chances. Now, the problem with his plan is that it's extremely ambitious, and yet his resources are somewhat limited. So when he starts going to the lower commands, to Rundstedt, to Model, his next two theater commanders, and he starts proposing this, what the planners eventually come up with is two concepts. One's called small solution, which is favored by the German field commanders. It's favored by Rundstedt, who commands OB West, and it's favored by Model, who commands Harris Group of B, Army Group B. And that would have basically involved an envelopment operation around Aachen to try to take the U.S. forces holding the German city of Aachen. But Hitler looks at that and says, that accomplishes nothing. It knocks a few American divisions out of the war, but in the end, Germany's left with a defense line there. It doesn't change the strategic picture at all. What he wants is what is called by the German planners the big solution. He wants to push all the way across the Meuse River up to Antwerp, split the U.S. and British forces, and in so doing, cause a major strategic shift in the war. Now, the big problem comes up to, what are the resources? Does he have the resources? I mean, the plan itself, in many respects, if you back off and just pretend he has an infinite amount of resources, yes, it could have made a major change in the war if he had the resources. But as we can see as we go into a little bit more detail, the resources are really not there. Now, why the Ardennes? It's somewhat obvious. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. The U.S. Army had to make some decisions about where they stationed their divisions in the autumn of 1944, early winter of 44-45. They were stretched all the way from the Belgian frontier way down to the Saar. So there was an awful lot of a front line. And Bradley made the decision that the Ardennes would be held with relatively modest forces. There were about 4 infantry divisions there in December 1944. And his feeling was the Ardennes is an awful area to try to stage a winter counteroffensive. That will end up being the case. I mean, Bradley was right in that respect. But where he was wrong is he didn't realize the desperation of the Germans, that the Germans might actually try a last-ditch gamble in the sector. So the map I'm showing here is the German enemy's west map. And the Germans had a reasonably accurate picture of the U.S. forces in the Ardennes. They didn't know all the details. As you can see, this is a map from the 7th of December, so the 106th Division isn't there yet. They come in only a few days before the start of the war. They don't know quite where certain divisions are, but basically they've got a clear idea of U.S. strength there, and they realize that the U.S. strength is fairly weak. So if we go to the next slide.
And Steve, just to interrupt a little bit there, I mean, you said there the Germans are reasonably aware of which units are there ahead of them, and that came up on the initial show in this series with Peter Caddick Adams about this sense of kind of complacency that set in with the Allied army. Nothing's going to happen until spring now, and the fact that the American army has this strength in depth where it can rotate its units in and out. At any point, do you think the Germans might have not launched this offensive had they not had this information about some of these units? You say the 106th, the 99th, some of these others coming into the line. Were they going to go ahead with it anyway, or was that just kind of a little bit of an additional boost for them?
I think that the bigger problem was the German tendency to underestimate the U.S. Army. I don't think it was the specific number of divisions or which divisions were there. I think they just underestimated the ability of the U.S. Army to respond. I think it's partly because the German contact with the U.S. Army up until 1944 showed the U.S. Army in a rather bad light, and the German Army didn't appreciate the difference between the U.S. Army of Tunisia in 1943 versus the U.S. Army in Normandy in 1944. And the reason is, you look at U.S. Army performance in Italy, it's actually not bad, but it was just a poorly conceived campaign. There's broader strategic problems with Italy than the actual tactical performance of the U.S. Army. But the German view of the U.S. Army tends to underestimate the U.S. Army capabilities. So when they look at these small number of divisions, they're hoping to succeed. They're hoping to get another Kasserine Pass type defeat. Attack a weak point in the U.S. Army lines and get great advances from it. They don't expect the U.S. Army to react anywhere near as quickly as it does because they don't appreciate the changes in the U.S. Army from 1943 to 1944. That's a broader picture. I put this map up for the simple reason, look at the road net in the sector. The big initial stage is going to be to drive from the German frontier up to the Meuse River. The road lines are those red lines going on either side of Liège. And so that's going to be the critical first stage. But the real issue here, and the reason the German counteroffensive has so many problems is there's not a great road net in this sector. Anybody who's driven through that area knows that the road net is relatively limited. One of the reasons is that we have to consider what Europe is like in 1944 versus what Europe is like today. Today there's no border posts. You can cross anywhere on the border, but back in the day, back in 1944, 1940, the border was closed. There were a limited number of customs posts. There were a limited number of good roads going through here. And as a result of that, the Germans had only limited access routes from the German frontier up towards Liège. And so as a result of that, it's going to channel them down some relatively narrow routes. And as I'll discuss in a moment too, there's other problems along the frontier. So maybe we can go to the next map here. Here's the actual 6th Army plan. The sector I'm talking about, the northern shoulder, is the area that was attacked by 6th Panzer Army, headed by Sepp Dietrich. It later became known as 6th Panzer Army because the backbone of the force was the SS Panzer divisions. It had 2 Panzer Corps, 1st SS Panzer Corps and 2nd SS Panzer Corps. The original first wave is going to be 1st SS Panzer Corps. The basic operations plan is there are a number of German infantry divisions. The German infantry divisions will create the initial breakthrough. This is very much standard doctrine. It's the same doctrine you'd find in the Red Army, same doctrine in the U.S. Army, same doctrine in the German Army. The infantry divisions do the immediate breakthrough. Once they're through, then the panzer divisions are introduced to do the exploitation missions. And so you can see here a list of Volksgrenadier units, starting with the 326 up north, 246. Now, the one that's going to concern us the most is 277th, sort of in the center of that line there, over on the right-hand side. To a lesser extent, 12th Volksgrenadier Division, and then below it, 3rd Fallschirmjäger, the 3rd Airborne Division. And then behind it are the 2 SS Panzer divisions, 12th SS Panzer Division. You can see it in the center right there. That's going to be the main unit I'm talking about. And then 1st SS Panzer Division. 1st SS Panzer Division is, of course, the division that launches Kampfgruppe Piper. I'm not going to deal with that in a lot of detail. That particular campaign or that particular battle has been well detailed anyways. I'm going to deal more with 12th SS Panzer, which has not been detailed to quite the same extent. And here's more of a fine-grained look at that same map, but looking a little bit more from the terrain standpoint. The frontier here has some interesting features. To begin with, it's heavily forested. The whole area on the Belgian side of the frontier is forested. It's mostly used for logging. This is large numbers of logging trails through the area. Not great for tanks, but they do allow some access. But the other feature, and one that's very important for the first day or two, is this is also the site of the West Wall. The defensive fortifications that were put up by the German army in the late 1930s to shield their western frontier. The West Wall was stripped of a lot of its equipment in the 1942-43 period to build up the Atlantic Wall, but it was still there. The tank traps were still there, the pillboxes were still there, and it's still sitting on the frontier. And as I'll mention, yeah, and here's a particularly good example, and this particular set of tank bearers will have a very big effect when we talk about this battle. If we can go back one slide, and I'll point out where that particular photo was taken. If you look at the very top of the map, Rollbahn A, these various routes were given letters. Rollbahn A is the northernmost. Rollbahn A was the least significant of these routes in the original plans. And the reason is that all that route consists of is a logging trail that goes through the Krinkhout Woods up on the far north. That was actually only supposed to be used for scouting purposes. That was not supposed to be used as a major avenue of approach for either the infantry or the armor divisions. The main roads, the really good ones, are the ones in the center, are Rollbahn C and D. These go through the Losheim Gap. There's some significant roads there. Once you get out into the open farm country beyond the fields, there's good roads leading up towards Liège and the Meuse River. So a big surprise, that's where both 1st SS Panzer and 12th SS Panzer, they had their Schwerpunkts, their focal points. They're supposed to be pushing through the Losheim Gap. Now, as we'll see a little bit later, this whole thing gets really screwed up, and that doesn't happen. Now, that photo that's coming up that we saw just briefly a moment ago, that one, that's up at the start of Rollbahn A. And the reason that this is important is when the campaign starts, the Germans don't want to warn the U.S. Army. This has to be a surprise attack. They know that there's fortifications and tank traps down along the frontier. They know that they're going to be pushing mechanized equipment and vehicles through the area, but they can't send engineer teams out in advance and blow up those tank traps. That's going to become a big problem on X Day, the start of the campaign. The reason obviously being that it's very hard to blow gaps in those dragon's teeth with limited engineer assets when you're under fire from the other side. So they have an immediate a problem as they try to make a fast penetration into the American defenses. That might seem like a trivial detail, but it becomes a major problem when the campaign starts off, especially in this area where the roads aren't very good to begin with and when large areas are forested. So why don't we jump ahead a slide? And as I say, this is the one, this is right where Rollbahn A starts. So this is a typical problem that the German army is going to face. And this is what Rollbahn A looks like. And this is going to be the main approach route for 12th SS Panzer during the battle for Krenkel-Rocherath. It's just a muddy little logging trail. That's all it is. It's not very wide. And as I'll describe in a moment or two, the weather at that particular point in time was very wet and muddy. So not only is there a problem that there's no asphalt, there's no gravel, it's just a mud trail. It's very narrow. It goes across bridges and brooks and streams. It's not the sort of route that you'd plan to use for a major offensive. And as I mentioned, Rollbahn A was not going to be the main route, but it just happened to end up that way.
And Stephen, how much input are divisional commanders, company commanders, battalion commanders allowed to have against this plan? Because the unit like the 12th SS, they've come out of Normandy, as you said earlier. They've seen the problems. I know the 12th SS aren't in the Bocage countryside as such, but they're seeing that problem of the Allies and Canadians are facing of moving down single roads and all the problems that brings in. Are they unable in this case to kind of make some suggestions and saying, look, experience tells us that going down single roads is not ideal?
What actually happens is that they have no input. At the divisional level, they have no input at all. This plan, of course, is absolutely top secret. In order to achieve surprise, secrecy is one of the central aspects of the plan. And so the divisional commanders don't get any input at all. The only level that gets a little bit of input will be at the level of the Panzer Army. Dietrich has a little bit of input, but quite honestly, not very much. And even at the higher commands, here's Group B with Model and OB West with Rundstedt. Both of them try to influence Hitler on this plan. And Hitler basically sends them a note and says, you're not to interfere with this plan. The plan is done in Berlin. Most aspects of it are done in Berlin with a very limited appreciation for the geography of this region. And the failure of this plan has an awful lot to do with the fact that the planners really didn't appreciate the topography of this battlefield. It leads to some of the early defeats, which just cascade into other problems later on in the campaign.
And is that partly due, Stephen, as well, to the fact that by this point of the war, Hitler's staff is more the people who've survived the politics than it is those who are good at strategy and tactics? That those kind of guys have either been killed or promoted out of the way or they've disappeared. And so it's more the yes men around them at this point than it would have been perhaps in 1940.
Very much so. A lot of this has resulted from the July bomb coup against Hitler, where the army tries to kill Hitler. So Hitler loses confidence in the judgment of the army. He now begins to regard the army, with the exception of the Waffen-SS, his personal armed forces, he regards the army as being suspect. And therefore, the only people he will trust is those commanders immediately around him, the people in the headquarters in Berlin. But the people out in the field, he's fired Rundstedt already a few times in 1944, so he doesn't have a lot of confidence in him. He perhaps has more confidence in Model, but Model in the cosmic scheme of things is not at that level of command. He is the Army Group commander, but he's not the theater commander. So Model may try to make some changes, but basically he's a little bit too far down the food chain to actually be listened to.
Cool.
I'm going to point out one thing here just to show the impact of topography. This is a German Westphal map from before the war. It shows the sector we're dealing with. It shows the southern side of where 12th SS Panzer Division would have been fighting. If you look sort of over on the right-hand side, you'll see some little symbols. That's where the West Wall is. All those little black dots are each of the individual bunkers. And where I have placed the arrow sort of in the center of the map is an area where there's a road coming in and then a rail line. One of the reasons that the Losheim Gap was a major objective is there was both a rail line and a road net, and therefore it was very attractive for a fast run up to Liège. Now, the problem is that there is first that whole series of dragon's teeth and other barriers near the frontier. And then there's a second problem once they get through there. And what the second problem is, there's a railroad bridge right where that arrow is pointing. The bridge was knocked down during the summer of 1944 fighting. It was not replaced. So what's going to happen down in this sector is that when 1st SS Panzer, when Kampfgruppe Piper comes up here, there's going to be a collapsed bridge over the road, meaning that nobody can get through until they can get engineer assets or something up there to clear that area. Now, there's a few problems there. The Germans, especially the Waffen SS Panzer divisions, have not been involved in offensive operations in the better part of 2 years, and they don't have the offensive tools to deal with some of these problems, especially mechanized engineer equipment. And so these minor, what would seem to most viewers as a minor topographical obstruction, becomes a major impediment and causes the plan to slide for a day. So what seems like a very, very minor thing becomes a very major plan when time is not on your side.
It might be a good idea to start jump in with a question now, because you may be covering this later on, but KG is asking about your comment on why not better march order planning, engineers up front and getting everybody getting off the roads. That's not important. Are you touching on this later, or do you want to address that now?
Yes, I am going to deal with it a little bit later. That's an extremely good point, and that is a central issue in the failure of this plan. But why it fails, let me talk about a few of the other issues,
Sure.
and then maybe we can go back to this, because yes, it is important, and I do want to deal with some of the underlying problems here. Once again, I'm going to step back a little bit more broadly now and just talk about autumn mist. Most people view or call the German offensive Watch on the Rhine. That's actually the earlier German plan. That's the first German plan from OKW. The actual plan that they're working with is codename Autumn Mist. But in any event, there was no formal schedule. There's no paper. I mean, you can go down to the U.S. Archives, the National Archives, and actually look at the German planning documents. There is no formal schedule. There's more general expectations. And so what the expectations are, the infantry divisions would be through those forests that I showed on the map by the morning of X Day. They expect to just go slicing right through. The infantry divisions would be 5 to 6 kilometers beyond the start line, the frontier, by noon of X Day. So that means they're out in those farm fields. They're past the forest. OKW Berlin expects to reach the Meuse River within 2 days. So they've gone through the forest, they're into the farm fields, they're moving fast. 6th Panzer Army expects 1 day to break the U.S. defenses, the first day of the campaign, the 16th. 1 day to pass over the Cevennes Highlands, 17 December. So they arrive on the Meuse roughly within 2 days. And then they cross. Then the U.S. Army would, now here's a critical thing. U.S. Army would take 3 days to respond. So they see this feasible. If they can get up to the Meuse River in 2 days, and it takes the Americans 3 days, then they're sitting on the Meuse in 2 days. So they have a good chance to build up the momentum to succeed at this offensive. So it's absolutely critical to the German plans to make those objectives in the first 2 days. So time is of the essence. Mm-hmm. So let's look. Okay, let's just look at the players. The big player here in my study was 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitler Youth. For anybody who's followed the Normandy campaign, they'll know that this division was largely destroyed in Normandy, suffered 8,000 casualties. The division, at least initially, fought mostly against the Canadian Army. The combat elements were very heavily destroyed. 12th SS Panzer Regiment, the armor element of the division, suffered 85% casualties. 26th Panzer Grenadier Regiment suffered 75% casualties. The Panzer Grenadier regiments at this point in the war had 3 battalion commanders and 12 rifle company commanders. Now, if you look at this division in November 1944, before the campaign, of those 15 regimental commanders, the 25th Regiment had only 1 of 15 as an experienced commander. 14 were brand new. In Panzer Grenadier Regiment 26, 3 were experienced, 15 were not. So when you talk about battle experienced divisions, that's not necessarily the case. There's a difference between battle experience and battle exhaustion. And 12th SS Panzer Division was shattered in Normandy and did not have the time to rebuild. It didn't begin serious reconstruction until the 15th of October, meaning only 2 months before the start of the Ardennes campaign. There was shortages across the board. There was no fuel for training. There was very little ammo. Equipment didn't start rolling in. For example, the new tanks that were supplied to the division didn't get there until November 1944. So very, very little training. The new tank crews were not experienced, very, very few experienced tank crews, and the new tank crews got very, very little training. So the 12th SS Panzer Division of December 1944 is not the 12th SS Panzer Division that faced the Canadians in June 1944.
But just playing devil's advocate for a second here, Stephen, because, you know, we've talked about the 12th SS a lot on this channel with Mike Bechtold and others over, you know, because normally I'm just down the road from where the actions took place, is that you could make the argument that had more of the division that survived Normandy been there in December, that would have been a disadvantage, not an advantage, because they had been thoroughly bested by the Canadians and British in Normandy. Maybe fresh troops who haven't been demoralized, as inexperienced as they could be, might be some kind of advantage. It's that old 1st Division, 29th Division Omaha. Do you go with your veteran troops or your new troops? And so what's your point about? What's your remark about that? Any validity to that?
My remark would be the ideal situation would have been to have had the 12th SS Panzer Division as it was on the 6th of June 1944, when it was well trained, very determined, and ready for battle. I'm certainly not arguing that the 12th SS Panzer Division of August 1944, after they got beaten up in Normandy, I'm not saying that division, a heavily demoralized division, I'm not saying that they would have been ideal.
Sure.
But the division in June of 1944, when it was fresh and well trained, and the critical difference between June 1944 and December 1944 is the division in December 1944 is not trained. The tank crews are not trained. It's simple matters like driving skills. We're not talking about elaborate tactical skills. They don't have that because there was no time. In fact, let's jump to the next slide. I have a few details about that. I'm going to skip some of these numbers and stuff. But the problem is that they got too few tanks. They got them too late. They had no time to train on them. They had no fuel. And all of their supporting elements are lacking. They're lacking their reconnaissance vehicles. They're lacking their half-tracks and the Panzer Grenadier regiments. When it comes to trucks, as you can see, they're supposed to have 933 cross-country trucks, which is critical in an area where there's no good roads. They only have about a third the number. Same thing with prime movers. And they're short of fuel. The idea that the campaign fails due to lack of fuel is not entirely correct. There's problems there. The division was allotted 5 consumption units, and they had 1.3 consumption units. Now, what that means is they had enough fuel to go 130 kilometers on the roads. It would obviously be less going cross country. So this is a division which is significantly under strength and undertrained. And let's jump up one more slide. And it's not only the 12th SS Panzer Division. That division is in bad enough shape. But if you take a look at the infantry divisions that have to perform the critical breakthrough operation, it's the infantry that's going to punch through the original American defenses and open up the gateway for 12th SS Panzer to start racing up towards Liège. So who do we have there? There's 2 infantry divisions or Volksgrenadier divisions in the 12th SS Panzer Division sector. There's the 277, which is a fairly ordinary Volksgrenadier division. It was destroyed in the summer of 44, rebuilt in the autumn of 1944. On the day that the campaign starts, it's at 72% strength, so it's already under strength. The German army at this point in the war had 4 combat values. They evaluated their divisions at 4 levels. Number 1 would mean a division ready for offensive operations. Number 2 would mean ready for limited offensive operations, good but not great. 3 means good for defense, but not good for offense. And so this division is rated only at 3. Its mission is going to be an offensive operation to break through, so it should be rated at 1. It's not. It's rated at 3. 12th SS, or 12th Volksgrenadier Division, was the best German infantry division in the ETO. It was one of Hitler's favorites. The division commander had been an aide to Hitler, and so he had the ear of Hitler's staff. If he needed new weapons, like if he wanted the new Sturmgewehr assault rifles, he could get stuff. But the problem is that because it was so good, it kept getting pushed into action. So it was pushed into the fighting at Aachen, and it was just chewed apart. It's not pulled out of the line till the 3rd of December, only a little bit over a week before the offensive starts. And a whole bunch of infantry replacements are dumped into it. So it's got some good experienced NCOs, some good experienced officers, but it has a lot of very inexperienced troops. The worst division in the sector is 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division. You know, when you stop to think about Fallschirmjäger divisions, especially in Normandy, they are the cream of the German light infantry. I mean, their performance in Normandy is great. In the winter of 1944, these divisions are awful. And the reason is where are they getting their personnel from? What happened in the autumn of 1944 is the Luftwaffe shuts down their bomber units, their reconnaissance units. They have no fuel. So they take all of those Luftwaffe personnel, you know, the maintenance crews and the officers and the staff people, and they push them into Fallschirmjäger units or into Luftwaffe field divisions. Well, these are intelligent, well-trained people, but they're not infantry soldiers. Yeah. They have not been trained as infantry officers or infantry NCOs. So there's nothing wrong with them as personnel. They're actually high-quality personnel. They just don't have the training.
And Greg Way made this point, Steve, on our show last week about the Lanzerath Ridge there, you know, that the third Fallschirmjäger are making rookie mistakes in the Ardennes, that the guys who fought in Normandy would say, what the hell do you think you're doing? Walking on an open slope down a road, you know, up a road towards a hilltop, you know. The guys who fought at Hill 192 in Normandy and places like that have been looking on these guys saying, what the hell are you doing, you guys? So it's yeah, they're definitely.
And that particular instance is the classic case. I mean, that particular engagement is the classic case showing how bad this division was.
And is it true also, sorry to interrupt you, Stevie, that the gulf between the best of what the Germans can put and the worst at the rear has never been wider, isn't it? You know, you know, Peter Caddick-Adams talked about the King Tigers, you talked about the new weapons that some of the units are getting, but at the other end, 50,000 horses involved in the offensive. This is the gulf has never been at its wider at this point there between the very best and the very worst. Whereas the Allies now, as we know, you know, everything's up by truck. There's, you know, everything is mechanized. The gulf between the front line and the rear line is never been smaller, I suppose.
Right. Yeah. There's a substantial difference in quality. And then the final point I made on this is that the standard tactic, and this is true about, once again, the U.S. Army or the Red Army, is when you do an attack like this, you usually use armor to help with the breakthrough. Not a Panzer division, but what you use is Sturmgeschütz brigades. And so there was a brigade promised to this particular corps to help break through. Well, these guys don't show up. And the reason they don't show up is there's road jams, and I'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. So let's jump to the next one. There's a big controversy about tactics. How are they going to get through the forests? The local commanders who have been there in the Eifel region and the Ardennes region, they've looked at this and they've said, okay, you know, we understand this terrain. This is not unusual terrain. Hitler, in the original planning, absolutely insisted that the offensive began with an artillery barrage. Now, that seems to make sense. I mean, you know, it doesn't seem to be unreasonable to expect that there'll be an artillery barrage, but there's a couple problems here. One of them is that the Germans have a shortage of guns. There's just not enough artillery to do the job. The second problem is there's a shortage of ammunition. Now, the reason about the shortage of ammunition is that this gets way back into the weeds. The U.S. Army, Air Force, and the RAF is currently waging the oil campaign against German industry, attacking the synthetic oil plants. Well, guess what? The synthetic oil plants also manufacture ammonium nitrate and most of the chemicals used for ammunition. So by December 1944, the ammunition supply is much, much smaller. So the Germans have a significant shortfall in artillery ammunition. Now, there's another problem. Hitler, because of the surprise factor of this plan, does not allow the frontline units to do artillery reconnaissance in advance. He doesn't want people sneaking across the border looking for targets, or forward observers doing stuff, or putting up balloons and kind of hinting that they're looking for artillery targets. Now, on the other side of the fence, the U.S. infantry, because it was in that sector for a few months, they were protected by trees and long shelters. Now, infantry out in the open in forests are very, very vulnerable. Anybody who's read about the Hurricane Forest or the Ardennes knows what happens in forests with uncovered infantry. The artillery comes down, strikes the upper parts of the trees. they detonate, it throws all of the shrapnel down at the unprotected infantry down in the trees. But that is not the case here in this sector because the U.S. infantry are sitting in log bunkers which protect them from tree bursts. So anybody who's going to go and bombard these forces are going to find that the artillery is not very effective because the troops are protected. Now, what happens on X Day is that Dietrich follows Hitler's orders to the letter and he fails. The artillery bombardment of the Allied lines is a failure. In the neighboring sector, in Manteuffel's 6th Panzer Army sector, Manteufel basically said, yeah, okay, we understand that, but we don't believe those tactics are going to work. And he ignores what Berlin is saying. Manteufel himself actually disguised himself and snuck across the border and started snooping around and saw what the conditions were like. And he says, artillery is not going to do anything here. All that artillery is going to do is warn the Americans. They're going to hunker down in their bunkers, and we're going to have an awful time fighting through. So he goes back to traditional German 1918 style infiltration tactics. And what he does in his sector is he, pays lip service to the instructions from Berlin. But the way that he does it in his sector is infiltration. You get some units going in there before the artillery strikes. You're already in the midst of the American units before the artillery strikes, and you make the breakthroughs. And he succeeds. 5th Panzer Army is the army that succeeds in the Ardennes. And it's because his initial breakthrough succeeds. Why don't we go to the next one?
And just Greg Way, when he was studying the casualties of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger, particularly the 9th Regiment, he was saying that in those first couple of days, the casualties they had were from artillery. And his theory is it's actually German artillery that's either falling short or friendly fire. So in fact, not only did it not affect the Americans that it's supposed to, it could even have been doing more damage to their own troops. Is that something you've read as well?
I'm going to show an actual example of that with 12th Volks Grenadier Division, right next door to 3rd Fallschirmjäger, just in a minute or two. But let me deal with some other background issues here before we get into the battle. So the one that I want to talk about to some extent is the weather conditions, because whenever you think of Battle of the Bulge, you think of the movie and, oh, it's snow and you got a foot of snow on the ground, etc. And that's really not the case. It had been snowing and there were freezing temperatures for the first 2 weeks of December in the Ardennes area, but a thaw had started on the 15th of December. And so what happened on the day the campaign starts, the 16th of December, there is still a little bit of snow in the forested areas, but by and large, it's drizzle and fog. You get the fog because the rain's coming down on top of the snow. So very nasty conditions to be fighting under. The autumn of 1944 was unusually wet. And the consequence of that is that, especially in the forested tracts, extremely muddy. And it leads to a condition that was called by the U.S. Army a front that's one tank wide, meaning you can't make broad advances. You have to go down with limited road nets that you have. And what this means is that the Germans couldn't wander off the roads with their tanks. You go wandering off the roads, you get stuck in the mud. So they get stuck going down the roads. And if you know what the Belgian topography is like, not only are there limited roads, but every single road is dominated by these little villages, which are full of these little stone buildings. And so every little village in this sector of the Ardennes is basically a little mini fortress. You have all of these little stone buildings that are ideal from a defensive standpoint. And that will be the story at Krinkel-Rocherath, which we'll be talking about.
Super.
Okay, next one. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, we'll start the battle. 16 December 1944. This is the defense sector on the U.S. side of the 99th Division, one of its infantry regiments, the 393rd, facing 277. So this is the breakthrough battle. The Germans have to get through this battle very, very quickly in order to let 12th-SS-Panzer advance quickly. So here's the map. You can see quite clearly that the U.S. positions are located along the forested edge. The forested edge and the west wall happen to coincide. So the forest starts to begin where the west wall ends. So you have a traditional pattern here where the Volksgrenadier Division is throwing forward all three of its regiments. It's facing the three battalions of the 393rd, so it's roughly has a 3-to-1 numerical advantage. In both of the southern sectors, where we're seeing the 990th and the 991st Volksgrenadier Regiment, there were no penetrations of the American lines. The reason for this was simply the artillery bombardment failed. The artillery bombardment came down. The U.S. troops were hunkered down in their bunkers, so they were shielded from suffering serious casualties during the initial phase of the attack. And so the Germans ran into a well-prepared American defense. The U.S. infantry, sat it out for the artillery barrage. As soon as the artillery barrage lifts, they're there in their forward trenches. And of course, the Germans are advancing across relatively open terrain, and they're chopped up. The only area where the Germans have any success is up near Hollerath Knee, that place where we saw the picture. And the reason is due to a rather strange occurrence a few days before the start of the campaign. At the very top of the map, where you see the symbols for L Company of the 393rd, that's an area that's called Rats Hill. Well, what was going on is the Germans had some units up there in the days before the offensive started, and they were firing down at the 393rd Infantry. 393rd Infantry gets fed up with it, and they say, let's deal with the Germans up on Rats Hill. So in the days before the start of the offensive, they send two of their companies, L Company and I Company, across the Olaf Creek, and they take over Rats Hill. Now, the problem with that is that it creates a gap between those two companies and K Company down below. Well, it just so happens that where the German objective is, that wooded path through the woods, happens to be right where there's the weak point between those three companies. And so the 989th does manage to penetrate through. They start to get some support. When they start to lag, they start getting some support from elements of 12th SS-Panzer Division. So they do succeed in getting onto Rollbahn A. So that forested path that I showed earlier, that path that was intended only really as a reconnaissance path, that becomes one of the few successes of 12th SS-Panzer Division on the first day of the campaign. But otherwise, they're stalled. Here's the southern side. This is where the 12th Volksgrenadier Division is trying to come through. Now, this is a critical sector because, as I said, the situation on the other side of the road, this is Rollbahn C and Rollbahn D. The other side is very open. There's good roads. There's roads leading up to Liège and to the Meuse River. Now, you were talking a few minutes ago about the danger of friendly artillery, and that's exactly what happens here with one of the two German regiments. This division, 12th Volksgrenadier Division, is a very experienced division. They have a lot of good troops in it, but they have a lot of young, inexperienced troops. They start going into the forest, and the U.S. units here had booby-trapped the woods. There were large numbers of booby traps up in the trees. So what was happening is that the officers, the experienced officers, were going up ahead of the troops with wire cutters and cutting the wires for the booby traps to prevent their troops from getting injured. Now, they're being accompanied by a lot of these young, inexperienced grenadiers who see the officers going around and cutting wire. So these young grenadiers see this, and they start cutting wire. But the problem is the wire that they're cutting is not booby traps. It's the field telephone lines that lead from the command elements back to the German artillery positions. And so what happens on X Day morning is the German infantry units start advancing through. They get their lines cut. The German artillery starts their pre-planned artillery bombardment. Well, guess what? They're bombarding their own infantry. And so one of these two regiments suffers very, very heavy casualties from friendly fire. And then on top of it, the U.S. infantry units have good forward observer positions, and they have good contact to artillery positions in the back. So the Germans are getting hit from both sides. And once again, these are infantry out in the open, or I shouldn't say out in the open, in a forested area where they are not protected by bunkers. So they have the worst of all worlds. And as a result, guess what? They don't have very much success penetrating through this line fast. This is going to take them more than a day of fighting to get through these defenses. And these defenses, as you can see, are not particularly strong. The classic case on this map, if you see the name Lanzerath, the little town of Lanzerath, and right up above it is the intelligence reconnaissance platoon of the 394th. And this is probably the most famous unit in this battle. This is the unit that wins all of those awards, Presidential Unit Citation, many other things, because they basically stop the 9th Regiment of 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division. And we were talking earlier about the inexperience of 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division. A little platoon stops a regiment for a whole day because 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division was so inexperienced and so incompetent. So that's one of the underlying themes in this first day of fighting. The infantry has some significant problems, both because of poor tactics in the plan, plus the inexperience of their own troops, plus just the general difficulties in this sector.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so now we're jumping ahead one day. The 277th has secured a limited breakthrough, unfortunately for them, not on the best road, on Rollbahn A, which on this map is way up there in the north. You see the name Olaf Creek, so you see the symbol for the 25th SS Panzer Grenadier units coming down along that line. Now, what had happened between the breakthrough on the 16th of December and 17 December is that 2nd Infantry Division, which had been up north of here fighting their own little offensive prior to the German offensive, they had heard the artillery bombardment down south of them. And General Robertson, the commanding officer of 2nd Infantry Division, started thinking, what's going on down there? Why all of the artillery down in the 99th Division sector? That doesn't make any sense. This was supposed to be a quiet sector. So he goes down there and he realizes pretty quickly that this is a fairly significant German operation. And so he contacts the Corps commander, 5 Corps Commander Giroux, and says to him, we've got to halt our offensive operations. And the reason that it was especially critical for 2nd Infantry Division is that 2nd Infantry Division was formerly in this sector before 99th was there. All of their logistics lines run through Krinkelt-Rocherath in this sector. So they know that if the Germans push through here, even if it's just a little local offensive, if the Germans get across the border, through the woods, and into the farm country, they'll cut their supply lines in this area. So Robertson is very concerned. So he gets Giroux's permission in the early morning hours of the 17th of December to push his 2 regiments, the 9th Infantry and the 38th Infantry, down through Rocherath to make sure that the 99th is backed up. Now, his 3rd regiment, the 23rd, is pushed into the woods to help reinforce the 99th Division. Robertson does not want the Germans coming through there. So there's beginning to develop a major infantry skirmish in the woods that are shielding Rocherath, but the Germans are slowly but steadily pushing through. The Germans rightly see that they've gotten a penetration along Rollbahn A, so they're moving some of those regiments that did not succeed in penetrating, they're moving them up to Rollbahn A. So they're reinforcing their breakthrough with additional infantry going through Rollbahn A. So that's the situation happening in the early part of 17 December on Rollbahn A. And this is going to be one of the few breakthroughs.
I don't know whether you're going to cover this later, Stephen, but KG is asking again from Charles McDonald's book, did the 23rd Infantry deal with Panthers that got slipped into, or were they really Jagdpanther 5s? Big difference in appearance.
There's a lot of questions as to what vehicles those were. When I did the book, the best guess that I could make is that they were actually the Jagdpanzer 4s. And I'm using the Jagdpanzer 4 designation. That's actually wrong. They should be called Panzer 4L or Panzer 4/70. But I think that the general audience will know what I mean. The Jagdpanzer 4 is the Panzer 4 chassis with the long L70 gun on it. Those were in that Jagdpanther or the Jagdpanzer Abteilung that was attached to 12th SS Panzer. That had 2 types of vehicles, Jagdpanthers and Jagdpanzer 4s. To the best of my knowledge, it was the Jagdpanzer 4s that were in the forest that were encountered by McDonald. For those of you who are not familiar with Charles McDonald, he was in 23rd Infantry. He's got one of the great accounts of this battle. He was a young company commander at the time. He was involved in those battles with the 23rd along Rollbahn A, and his unit happened to encounter some of the German armor. Now, the German armor is having tremendous difficulty here, because if you remember that picture that we showed earlier on, it's just these muddy little slopes. It's very hard to move the armor down along these roads and to do anything there. But they do manage to move some of the Jagdpanzer 4s and some of the Panther tanks through here during the course of the 17th of December.
And just a general question about communication, Stephen, and I'll let you go back to your presentation. Right. You're talking about the roll barns and A, B, C, and D, and is there communication across those fronts, or does communication go stovepipe manner back to arming out again? Because with the timings being so critical, it seems to me that everybody in those advances must be aware what other people are getting up to in their advances. Otherwise, it's not coordinated.
The Germans have a variety of communication problems. One of the problems is going back to that bigger story about, the oil campaign, and the Germans have shortages. One of the critical German shortages in December of 1944 is there's no batteries. So, there's a shortage of tactical radios to begin with. But one of the reasons that the radios are so infrequently used is there's no batteries. And the batteries don't last very long. So it sounds like a minor little technical detail, but if you have no batteries, you have tactical radios that require batteries, you're not going to have radio communication from the forward elements back. Now, of course, the vehicles are in a different situation because their radios are powered off the vehicle generators. So that's not an issue. But for these Volksgrenadier units, they're very heavily dependent on field telephones. And so that means laying wire. And so to the extent that they can lay wire and get wire up front, they will have some communications back. But it's not going to be great for the first day because, we've seen pictures of what that terrain looks like. It's difficult to lay wire under these circumstances. And it becomes especially difficult because, as I'm going to point out in a moment, these forests are being bombarded by U.S. artillery. Yeah. So a lot of the wire is being chopped up by artillery. So the bottom line answer is yes, the communications tend to be stovepipe. One of the reasons being, once again, shortages that the Germans suffered from at the beginning of the campaign.
Okay, perfect.
Now, what's going to develop here in this particular sector, and one of the key battles, is the defense of the Lausdell Crossroads. This is one of the absolute critical battles of the Ardennes, and it's going to be instrumental in the American victory in this sector. What happens is that, as I mentioned, General Robertson is pushing two of his regiments down towards Krinkau-Rocherath to build up defenses there to hold back any German advance, beyond the forest. As he's doing it, he realizes he's got to give those two regiments time to build up their defenses. Coming down the road is an element from 9th Infantry, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel William McKinley, the great nephew of the American president from the turn of the 19th, 20th century. So Robertson sees McKinley. McKinley's a highly respected young officer, tells McKinley to take his unit, the 1st Battalion of the 9th, set it up at the Lausdell Crossroad, and as he says, hold this crossroads at all costs. This crossroad controls the two roads coming out of the forest heading into Rocherath. So Robertson realized that this is a critical junction. He's got to stop the Germans from getting past this crossroads and give time to the other two regiments to set up defenses at Krinkau-Rocherath. And so this begins evening of the 17th of December, fighting through the morning of the 18th. And it's a classic battle of the Alamo. The U.S. troops are stationed out in the middle of these muddy fields in very simple trenches. There's a couple of small buildings. There's a few fences, but there's really no defense out there. They're completely exposed. It's just muddy fields. By dusk and by nightfall on the evening of 17th December, 12th.SS-Panzer Division has got a number of Panther tanks through the woods. They've got a number of Jagdpanzer IVs through the woods, and they've got infantry reinforcements. They start advancing across those fields. If you look at the artist's depiction, it's that tree line at the top of the picture. So the tanks start coming across. It's absolutely pitch dark. The absolutely most vital asset that McKinley has is he has a forward observer with a radio. And the forward observer is connected both with 12th Infantry Division artillery, 99th Division artillery, and the Corps artillery. He's able to bring in the firepower from about 9 battalions of field artillery. And so this battle is basically McKinley's infantry holding the Germans in place with small arms fire and machine gun fire, while the U.S. artillery mercilessly beats the Germans as they're coming out of the woods. So it's a scene out of hell. The battlefield is illuminated by illumination rounds coming in from the U.S. artillery. The German tanks are being illuminated by the star shells. The forward observer is calling in fire very, very close to the American lines. The U.S. lines, in some cases, are getting overrun by tanks. Some of the German tanks and armored vehicles, Jagdpanzer IVs, get past the American defenses, get down to the outskirts of Krinkau-Rocherath. They then start engaging in elements with the 38th Infantry. But basically, McKinley holds Lausdell Crossroads through the morning of the 18th. Absolutely vital defense, makes a very big difference in this sector. So why don't we jump here? Here's a satellite view, gives you a better sense of what it looks like. You can see basically flat farm fields with the forested areas over to the east and slightly to the north. And this area today is very, very similar. It has not changed that much since World War II.
Niels Henkermans is asking kind of what size area we're talking about as a killing ground. A few square kilometers, I'm guessing.
This map, I thought I left a little symbol up. I think if we go back to the map, I may have had a meter stick on it.
Yeah.
There we go. You can see a meter stick down there. So the far left side of the map, where 38th Infantry is going down towards Lausdell, is about 1,000 meters. When we go to the big picture, when we go to the next picture, the Google thing, Lausdell Crossroads is located. If you look in the upper center, Krinkelt-Rocherath is that conglomeration of buildings that's sort of in the center left side. And so if you go up a little bit more towards the northeast and you see a little bit of buildings up there, that's Lausdell up there. So from the town out to that crossroads, it's maybe 1,000 meters.
Okay.
And this whole scene here is, I would guess, maybe about 5 kilometers across. So it's a relatively small area.
Perfect.
Okay, so here we see afternoon of the 18th. So by this time, McKinley has given permission to withdraw. By this stage, the unit has been decimated, more than decimated. There's only a small fraction of the men still surviving. They pull off up to the northwest. But by this time, 38th Infantry has managed to establish its defenses in the twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath. So they're in these nice little stone villages. Now, I might also add that they have the usual divisional reinforcements, meaning they've got the better part of a tank destroyer battalion equipped with M10 tank destroyers and a tank battalion. Tank battalion happens to be 741st Tank Battalion, where everybody knows D-Day will know was the tank battalion that landed at Omaha Beach with the 16th Infantry. So very famous U.S. independent tank battalion. But in any event, they're rather firmly ensconced in the village. And 12th SS-Pz Division decides it's got to get into the village while it still has the opportunity. And so they make a panzer charge. They basically decide, we've got to win this fast. Time is not on our side. We're already behind schedule. Let's get into the village. Let's swamp these American defenses, push through the villages. And that's the only way that we're going to succeed. And we're already behind times. So they make a panzer attack. Now, the problem that they face is, panzer attack is great if you've got infantry support, because if you get into a stony little village that's occupied by infantry, you're going to have a rough time. But how do you get the panzers and infantry in there when the infantry is going to get slaughtered crossing those fields by artillery and small arms fire? And that's what happens. So let's move on to the next slide. Here's some pictures of what happens.
And Mike Smeet's watching. Preempted your use of the word Panzer graveyard. Just a couple of minutes ago, he said this is what it becomes. And yeah, these photos here are just, they show it exactly.
Yeah, the term Panzer graveyard is actually the German expression. It comes from some of the German tank veterans who fought in these battles. They called it the Great Panzer Graveyard because so many tanks were knocked out in this very, very small area. And the reason was they got into this little town, but all their infantry had been stripped away. The infantry had been shot off the tanks. They were doing the traditional tactic. You put the infantry up in the tanks, you charge into the village with the infantry on the tanks. That's fine unless you're under very severe artillery bombardment, which is what was happening. So the infantry was knocked off the tanks. So the tanks got into the villages without any infantry. Well, the town is swarming with American infantry, and this is an experienced unit. It's an experienced element of the 2nd Infantry Division who's been fighting almost since D-Day. They have lots of bazookas. They have 57 millimeter anti-tank guns. And as I say, they have 2 armored battalions inside that town. They got a battalion of M4 Sherman tanks and a battalion of M10 tank destroyers. And this town is ideal for defense. It's all these stony buildings that you can see here. So the tanks come in, and the Panther tank is great if you're out in the open. But if you're in these narrow little stony streets and you're getting shot at from the side, not the front armor. Panther's great with front armor, but its side armor is nothing special. And, side armor is easy to knock out with a 57 millimeter gun or a bazooka or any of that sort of thing.
And it's
So
interesting. I know you're obviously a tank guy, Stephen, but we so often talk about on World War II TV that top trumps approach to looking at World War II, where this tank is better than this tank. But this is the classic example of it actually being a combination of everything that's taken out these vehicles. It's allied artillery, it's infantry with anti-tank weapons, it's anti-tank guns, it's armor, it's air power coming into the picture later on. It's using all of our arsenal against this force, not relying on one aspect of it.
It's combined arms. I mean, you hear the term always used, it's combined arms. But in the case of tank tactics, it's the circumstances.
Yeah.
Once again, if you're out in the Russian front, you got your Panther tank and you're fighting against Russian tanks 2,000 meters away, and you're protected by this wonderful frontal armor, and you got this very powerful 75 millimeter gun. Panther tank is wonderful. It's the best tank of this period of the war. But if you're in a Panther tank and you're in a little village on little narrow streets, facing infantry, being bombarded by artillery, facing bazooka fire and anti-tank gun fire, and not able to use your thick protective frontal armor, not able to use your powerful gun. The Panther tank at that point is just any other tank. I mean, a Panzer IV is just as good. Any tank at this stage is just as good, or for that matter, just as weak. If you don't have infantry support, you're in a world of hurt. And this map makes it very, very clear. 38th Infantry, by the end of the battle, there's a map in the combat interviews down at the archives showing where they knocked out. They claim 67 tanks, and that should be interpreted to mean tanks and armored vehicles, Panzer IVs, other vehicles. Here's where the tanks were knocked out during the fighting, and I have a little graphic up at the top showing what the cause was, at least based on the assessment by 38th Infantry. And keep in mind, the 38th Infantry later reclaimed this battlefield. They were pushed out of Krinkhout-Rochroth the following day, but they came back, and most of these wrecks were still sitting there. So there's a reasonably good reason to believe that this is reasonably close. It's maybe a bit exaggerated, but it's within the ballpark. So it was a very dense killing ground as far as the 12th SS Panzer was concerned. Okay, now let's look at the big picture. We've just seen what happened to 12th SS Panzer Division. They throw their main asset, they throw their Panzer Regiment, and they throw their two Panzer Grenadier, one of their two Panzer Grenadier regiments into the fray, suffer wicked casualties. They're way behind schedule. They think, or they look back at the plan. The plan said the Panzers would cross the Meuse on the 19th of December. But on the 19th of December, 12th SS Panzer Division is still entangled in Krinkhout-Rochroth. And what does that mean? The schedule is way, 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 way behind. I mean, critically so. We look at what's happening. I didn't deal with 1st SS Panzer because it's sort of outside of the sector, and I just want to keep on the focus. But what's happening in the neighboring sector to the south is Comp Group Piper is more or less in the same circumstances. They're trapped in Le Glaise. Everybody knows that story. That's a well-known story, so I won't deal with it in detail. But both of the spearheads of 1st SS Panzer are trapped. Piper up in Le Glaise and 12th SS Panzer in Krinkhout-Rochroth. Now, the plan had been is that once they got the penetration through, then Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army was going to take all of 2nd SS Panzer Corps and throw that through and explode it with even more Panzer divisions. But they can't do that because these the two spearheads are trapped. Now, the other thing that happens as a result of this is that there was actually going to be a 4th German army, the 15th Army, committed to the Ardennes campaign. 15th Army was going to intervene up in the Aachen area. Hitler looks at what's happening. He's no fool. He sees that they're not getting the breakthroughs on the schedule, and he refuses to commit the 15th Army. So the Ardennes campaign, the Ardennes offensive, has just lost a quarter of its intended assets because of the failure in the sector. So by the 19th of December, 6th Panzer Army accepts the fact that the 1st SS Panzer Corps attack has failed. It's clear. An absolutely critical decision. The German headquarters realizes that the schedule is impossible. And as a result, they take 2nd SS Panzer Corps and they say, we're not going to try to push through in the Lausanne Gap area. We're going to push them through where we have had success. And where they have had success by this time is 5th Panzer Army, Manteuffel's Panzer Army, further to the south, further to the west. Now we're talking more of the sector around Monheim. We're talking Bastogne, that sector. But the northern sector, which was supposed to be the Schwerpunkt, which was supposed to be the focal point, has failed. They have not gotten through there. They have to go through further south. That dooms the program because The south is not a good avenue to approach Liège and approach the Meuse River. And of course, those bigger issues. It's taken them too long to do it. The U.S. Army has started to react. So these early border battles are absolutely critical to derailing the German plan.
And it's interesting at this point to reference, because you mentioned Bastogne right at the beginning there, is this is all taken place before Bastogne is even surrounded. The narrative of so many, I talked about it earlier last week, that when you see the newspapers commemorating the Battle of the Bulge, it's the 77th anniversary, it's always the focus is on Bastogne. As you said, it's a great story and there's lots to see there in the museums and monuments, but the battle, the point you're making, and indeed other presenters have made these 2 weeks, is actually the battle has already been turned. The turning point has already happened. Bastogne is not going to influence it in that way. The writing is already on the wall.
That's the core theme of my book. That the Battle of the Ardennes was decided in the first few days. It was decided in this northern sector. Not only Krinkau-Rocheroth, of course, Glaze with Comp Group Piper, but the 12th SS-Panzer Division is symptomatic of the problems that the Germans had on the offensive and the kernel of why the offensive failed. And let's jump one more slide. I think this is just a quick recap of what the situation was like right before Christmas. Basically, the sector becomes a stalemate. Now, the battle I'm not going to talk about, just for lack of time, is what happened after Krinkau-Rocheroth, because Krinkau-Rocheroth is eventually taken by 12. Basically, 2nd Infantry Division withdraws up onto the Elsenborn Ridge. So then 12th SS-Panzer Division in the subsequent few days, the 20th, 21st, tries to attack the Dombutenbach Manor Farm. We can see that sort of in the center, lower center, where the 26th Infantry is located. And then gets stopped there by the 26th Infantry Regiment of 1st Infantry Division. Another classic battle, another sort of Alamo type battle, small infantry force holding the Germans in place while the artillery slaughters them. Another critical battle. I'm not going to deal with it today. It is covered in detail in my book, but it happens a few days later. So that's the situation here, right before Christmas, right before Bastogne. Basically, this sector remains the same until January. The attack in the sector has been completely stopped.
I mean, you mentioned Hitler's failure to send up the reserves a minute ago, but at this point now, speaking in a counterfactual kind of way, is there anything the Germans could have done now, a last throw of the dice that could have swung things in their favor if they'd been bold enough, or is there really nothing else they can do now?
The one problem that they have at this stage, and the one problem that they have moving their reserves, is the road network situation on the German side in the Eifel region of Germany. I didn't get into it in a lot of detail in this talk, but the German units, even the lead units like 12th SS Panzer, were staged deep into Germany. They were not right up on the Belgian border until the day or so before the attack began. The road net from Germany to the Belgian border is not great. There was not a lot of economic interplay between Germany and Belgium before the war in this sector. As you can see by the pictures, it's mostly an agricultural region. There's some wooded areas that are used for forests and stuff. So there were no reason to have great roads or great communication links. So as a result, it's very hard for the Germans to start moving material from Cologne or the other sectors there over to the German frontier. Now, what of course has happened between 16 December when the offensive starts and where we're talking about now, start of the third week or so of December, the Allied air forces are out in force. And it's not only 9th Air Force, the tactical people, B-26 and that sort of stuff. They call in the big stuff. They start calling in 8th Air Force. So 8th Air Force is sending in B-17s to bomb the German rail nets over on the German side of the frontier, out in Cologne and down along the Rhine River and all of the rail stations. The Germans can't move at this stage. So even if the weather's crappy, the Allied Air Force are just out and bombing everlasting hell out of all of the railroad stations on the German side of the frontier. So even if the Germans had some reserves, which they don't really have, they wouldn't have been able to move them.
And that's the point Jonathan Bernstein made when he did the show with us last week about the 9th Air Force, is that the overriding theme we've come is that the failure of the German plan and the success of the Allies is never just one thing. You've made a very strong case for this sector here, but actually it's a combination of factors up and down. And again, this rather overemphasis on Bastogne is not really helping the general public understand that many things contribute to this whole situation.
That's exactly it. And, so tactical air didn't have very much to do with the, when you start to think of tactical air, you think, well, where was tactical air with Krinkow-Roschroth, or where was tactical air with Dom-Budenbach? It didn't have any role at all to play, partly because of weather. There was very low cloud cover. But tactical air power had an enormous role to play from the operational perspective, because they were over on the German side of the border, just raising hell with the railroad network and the
Yeah, the
military.
railroad. We had that. The railroad cars, the
Oh, yeah,
numbers they lost
yeah,
there. It's just chipping away at that
exactly.
ability for the Germans to bring up more troops. So here is your list of failure points.
So
It's
here's
a
here's the
sorry
reason.
list, isn't it? Really?
Here's the reasons, and here's why the decision was made before Bastogne even becomes an issue. I mean, Bastogne becomes an issue around Christmas Day. So on Christmas Day, Rundstedt, the commander of OB West, basically the theater commander, he asked Berlin to switch to a defensive posture. He wants to stop the offensive. He knows he can't succeed. He's seen what happens. He knows he can't succeed. On top of the failures in the in Dietrich sector, 5th Panzer Army, after the reinforcements with 2nd SS-Pz.Korps, were halted both the attack near Bastogne and the attack towards Mannheim. Mannheim is where 2nd SS-Pz.Korps intervenes. The big picture. The plan overestimates German capabilities and underestimates U.S. capabilities. Reinforcing the point I made before, the weather and the mud forced the Panzers to fight for the villages. This meant a slow attritional fight. The German artillery was insufficient to overcome the initial U.S. defenses. But on the other hand, from the other perspective, U.S. artillery was absolutely lethal against German artillery or German infantry in the Elsenborn sector. It was the key element of the combined arms team. The infantry was certainly essential, but the artillery was the real killing arm in this battle. But to re-emphasize the point over and over again, U.S. combined arms teams were very successful in village defense. It wasn't simply the infantry or the artillery or the tank destroyers or the tanks. It was all of those combat arms fighting in unison. And then, the other point that I made, after the failure of Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army in this sector, both with Kampfgruppe Peiper and with 12th SS-Panzer Division, there's really no operational opportunities in the Bastogne sector. Let's even just pretend that Manteuffel succeeds and pushes through Bastogne, captures the town of Bastogne, and pushes past Bastogne. Anybody who's been over in that sector knows that once you go from Bastogne, you go over towards the Meuse River, what do you hit? You hit the town of Dinant. And if you've ever been in Dinant, what's sitting in Dinant? Dinant is blocked. The road going over the Meuse past Dinant is blocked by this narrow little rocky defile. And what, of course, happened within the first 2 or 3 days of the offensive is that Bradley got on the phone with Montgomery, and Montgomery sent British tank units down. So there is a British tank regiment or armored regiment sitting on the Dinant side of the Meuse River. So even if the German tanks get across get through Bastogne and get over to the Meuse River, they go to their main crossing point in Dinant, and there's British tanks sitting there in force. There's a British armored division over on that side of the river. So they're not going anywhere. And then, of course, the U.S. by that stage is mobilizing all sorts of other forces. So, Patton by that stage has his armored divisions moving up. So there's just no opportunities in the Bastogne sector. And, of course, Bastogne is much further away from the main objective, which is Antwerp. So this campaign is ended. There's no opportunities. Once that northern sector is sealed off, there's no operational opportunities.
One comment that came up in the sidebar earlier is of course, not the way it's beyond the scope of what we're talking about today, is how long it took the Americans to then retake some of the areas they lost, because that shows how good the Germans were at defense, because it takes through January, almost into February in certain sectors to kind of to get back to the position they had been in early December. So that's testament to the Germans' resilience, I suppose.
It is, but also keep in mind what happens after the Christmas fighting around Bastogne. The weather turns absolutely horrible. As everybody knows, right around Christmas Day, the weather fronts changed. So it had been very overcast, relatively mild, very rainy. Christmas Day, Christmas Eve wanders around. There's a hard frost comes in. A high front comes in from the Russian front from the east. Becomes very, very cold. It starts snowing. So there becomes very significant problems on both sides, both on the German side and on the American side, to do anything, because there's deep snow. There's 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot of snow. The U.S. Army's in no rush to seal off the Bulge. Everybody says, "Oh, the German defense are wonderful." I don't mean to belittle the German defenses. The Germans had always been very strong in defensive tactics. But on the other side, the U.S. Army is not making any rush to crush the Bulge for the simple reason that it's going to be costly under the circumstances. It's difficult under the weather conditions. They have other fish to fry. Keep in mind that they do have offensive operations planned to start up in late January, early February. So they're not going to divert resources from the January, February attacks in order to push the Bulge out.
So you're saying that they're switching back to operating it on their terms. They've been forced to react to the German terms, but now, it's over now. We're going back to our original schedule, our original operations, and we're controlling things, I suppose. Yeah.
The strategic initiative returns to the Allies. And there is the other campaign, of course, that happens kind of the second of the German offensives, and that's the Operation Nordwind offensive that starts on Christmas or on New Year's Eve down in Alsace, down around Strasbourg and Colmar in that area there. So that ties down 7th U.S. Army. So, there's no way to pull resources out of 7th U.S. Army and move them up to the Bulge. They've already pulled out Patton from that sector already. A good chunk of Patton's Third Army has come out of that sector, so they don't want to deplete it even further. So, the bottom line is the U.S. Army is not any rush, and they don't want to suffer the casualties. The U.S. Army, like the British Army, is very casualty adverse. And fighting, these type of battles of the winter months is not anybody's idea of a low-cost, non-attritional battle. It's going to be a high-cost, attritional infantry struggle, and the U.S. Army just doesn't want to do it.
Yeah, no, very good point. And that's something Peter Caddick-Adams, I know he's working on his third book, Sand and Steel, Snow and Steel, that concentrating on that last 3 or 4 months of the war. And, the main point he's going to be making is we're over the hump now. We don't want to lose many lives now. If it takes a little bit longer by using steel, that's going to be the overall plan. We don't need to be desperate now and throw men in. We can take our time and just work things out methodically, I suppose.
And that's the rule. It's steel rather than blood. You'd rather use artillery ammunition and tanks than you would infantry.
But you use all this might we've spent the last 4 years building up, essentially. Exactly. That's why our factories have been working, churning out all these tank destroyers and tanks and artillery pieces and shells by the million. Use them. It's simple, really.
And at the operational level, it's the air forces too. People don't stop to think about that, but the Allied forces, the British Army, the U.S. Army, have the air element far better integrated than anybody else.
Yeah.
The air element in these campaigns is absolutely essential. And both the British and the Americans treat air as being an essential element of all of these campaigns.
Yeah, well, we'll bring things to an end there, Steve. I hope, sincerely hope this won't be the last. It's your first appearance on World War II TV. I hope it won't be your last, because it's been just really a masterclass in presentation. People have thoroughly enjoyed it. The conversation, the sidebar has always been illuminating. I'll go back and read some of your brilliant comments there, viewers. I'll just remind people what we're coming up, and I'll say goodbye to second, Steve, so just bear with me. So, folks, nothing for the weekend. I will wish you all a happy new year. I will see you after the weekend. Monday, Dr. Nina Jans is joining us from Luxembourg to talk about the burial of those who fell in the Battle of the Bulge, particularly from the German point of view, German cemetery, but also the American. Peter Caddick-Adams is wrapping things up. He'll be expanding and taking forward what Steve has been sharing with us today and talk about kind of what happened next after the Battle of the Bulge. And then the show that had to be rescheduled because Jonathan had some issues about the Tommies, the British and the Battle of the Bulge, particularly the 53rd Welsh Division. Jonathan Ware is coming on that on January the 8th. So it's kind of falling after we kind of bring the Battle of the Bulge series to an end, but it'll be worth waiting for because as a Brit, we're essentially saving the best to last. That's how I will word it. As usual, folks, don't forget to follow what we're doing on Twitter, social media. Consider becoming a patron or a member of the channel. The links to Steve's book about this is in the description below. I'm holding up again, but of course, you'll find all sorts of amazing books he's written because he is prolific. So you can't go wrong with his output there. But right now, just thank you very much for joining us, Steve. Did you enjoy it?
Oh, certainly enjoyed it. I always like talking about this subject.
Brilliant. Well, I'll definitely invite you back for something else in the future. I don't know. I'm going to do an artillery week at some point. That might be something to bring you in on. But yeah, been brilliant stuff. So happy New Year to you, Steve. Happy New Year to everybody else watching. And I will see you on the other side in the new year. Cheers, everybody. This is Paul Dutch from World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.